I want to welcome you all to an event co-sponsored by the Hofstra Cultural Center and the Asian Studies program. I am very, very pleased to introduce Dr. Phillip Guingona, who is an assistant professor of world history and Asian history. Can you hear me?
Oh, are we muted?
No, they told me to turn it off.
Can you hear me? Okay, let me start again. So I just wanted to welcome everybody to this event. I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Phillip Guingona, who is an assistant professor of world and Asian history and the chair of the Department of History at Wells College. Dr. Phil, he prefers his students to call him that, looks at the modern world. And in particular, he is very much interested in the entangled histories of China and the Philippines in the early 20th century. And he looks at port cities in Asia. He looks at Islam in China and the Philippines, Asian educational missions, and so forth. He is currently working on a monograph that is entitled Before a Vast Ocean, A World History of China and the Philippines, 1900 to 1950. Today, he will be giving a talk that is entitled The Triangle Defense. How I lost that slide. Sorry. Hey.
Should be right up on the screen. Triangle offense.
I don't have it. I don't have it on my screen. That's the funny thing. I don't have that screen. The triangle offense, how basketball helped and hindered the relations between China, the Philippines, and Japan in the early 1930s. I've bastardized the title because I don't see it in front of me, but this is a very exciting topic about the role of sports in diplomacy and other events. With no further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Guingona to begin his talk.
Thanks. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. This is a great turnout for a nice Monday afternoon event, especially a sunny afternoon event. And actually, I'm up here. It's sunny. I assume it's sunny down there as well. Can you all hear me? And can you see the slides in front of me? The triangle offense: how basketball united and divided.
I actually don't see the slides.
Yes, I can see them.
Absolutely. So getting some yes and no. Do you know why you can't see? Maybe let me try to not unshare it and reshare it and see if that works.
Philip, I can see it. I'm not sure why some people are not seeing it.
Do you have it on full?
There it is. There's a square.
I know, but I can't.
Let me just try it again, just to stop share and start share.
Oh. Right there.
Share.
Up. Now I see it.
No.
Yeah. Okay, so let me get started. And thanks a lot for the introduction, Patricia. Yeah, so as Patricia was mentioning, this is part of a larger monograph that I'm working on called Before a Vast Ocean, A World History of China and the Philippines, circa 1900 to 1950. And in this book, I use different world history methods to explore different aspects of relations between China and the Philippines in the early 20th century. So for example, in the first, well, I guess technically the second chapter, I look at the Filipino community in Shanghai and the Chinese community in Manila and looked at these mirrored diasporas. And I use different world history methods to approach that. I use diasporic studies, new imperial history, and urban history to look at those relations. So this talk today is the final section of the final chapter of my book project on interactions through sports. And this chapter really uses sports history, area studies, and event history to really sort of finish the chronology and discuss connections between China, Japan, and the Philippines during this time period. It really focuses on two major dates in particular: 1921, which I call this period of coalescence, in which athletes all gathered together in Shanghai, and along with those athletes came, coaches, diplomats, observers, and this was sort of a period of possibilities, of really sort of an open and positive relationship between China and the Philippines. Whereas 1934, the time period that I'm focusing on today, was more the opposite. This is after the Mukden incident with the creation of Manchukuo in northeastern China, which led to, oddly enough, a rift in relations between China and the Philippines. And then in the middle, I also talk about the sort of the study in Springfield College of a lot of the athletes who took part in these games and who became prominent physical educators in China and the Philippines, respectively. So it's a little bit of a circuit, but that's what this talk today is situated in. And the 1934, sort of the end of the games, and sort of the disintegration in a lot of ways of the relationship between China and the Philippines. So I thought I'd start off, as I want to do, with a nice quote. This is from a booklet or a pamphlet that was created in preparation for the 1934 Far Eastern Championship Games. This is a commentary by a fellow named Phillip B. So this is like a pamphlet that people distributed before the games to hype them in Manila. So he wrote, quote, and I guess I can't see the full quote because our boxes are here on the side, but I'll guess what's there. I think I can do it. The people of the Far East will be bound together not by diplomatic ties and international treaties, but by the cord of mutual understanding, which, if you please, I shall call it the placenta of sportsmanship. And I like this quote because it's, well, first of all, it's a very awkward metaphor, and I like awkward metaphors for some reason. But also it describes some of the themes that we're going to be, that I'm going to be talking about today. Sports is this event that can link people together and bring people, and also tear people apart. So I'll let Laguatan set the stage for us. Okay, so before I go too much farther, I'm curious if any of you, and I think this works in Zoom, I think you can do a hand raising. Have any of you heard of the Far Eastern Championship Games? If you have, could you raise your hand on Zoom? So I see Patricia, I see Carol, I see, well, I guess you two should know. So I'm not seeing too many hands here. I think I just see two. All right, then, well, let me give you a little, you can lower your hands now. All right, then, let me give you a little bit of a background on the games first, then, before we dive into the details of the 10th and final Far Eastern Championship Games. So the Far Eastern Championship Games, they're the precursor to the Asian Olympiad. The first one started in 1913. It was originally proposed by American missionaries as part of the YMCA. It is an Asian Olympiad. It featured team sports. There was basketball, baseball, volleyball, track and field events, you name it. They hosted it at these Olympics. Eventually, it actually became the sort of direct, what do they call it, like the feeding event for the like the International Olympics. So it had very much an official air to it. Very soon after its inception, the sort of directorship of the institution, the Far Eastern Athletic Association, transferred hands to folks from Asia. The three main countries in the Far Eastern Championship Games were China, Japan, and the Philippines, hence the triangle that I start with there at the top, rather for the title, and they would switch host countries between these three countries. So it was held in Manila, then Shanghai, then Tokyo, then Manila, Shanghai, Tokyo. Sort of this circle type hosting. Right. Okay, so from there. And I can show you, 1934 was the final was the final game. The 10th rendition. It was held in Manila in May, which is a pretty bad time actually to hold a conference in Manila. This is like the beginning of the monsoon season. And I'll actually get to that in one second. Earlier in my chapter, something that I'm not going to talk about today, reunions every time that it came to the Far Eastern Championship Games. People would gather together and I guess rebuild their relationships after some time apart. So this is what the schedule looked like for the 1934 games. It's probably a little bit small on your end, but it's pretty much nonstop activity for an entire week in the middle of May. It starts with the opening ceremony and then I think it's right to baseball first. And then you got all your team sports and your track and field events and et cetera, et cetera. And this is what the venue looks like right here. This is the brand new baseball stadium. By the way, they spent a whole lot of money building all these facilities. And later, a little bit of a flash forward, a preview. Japan and China both threatened to boycott the Olympics, and the Philippines didn't want to lose all that money. So there's always some finances floating around in the back of all of these disputes, right? So you have the baseball field, the track and field and soccer field, you have the aquatic center is C, and the tennis court is D. You'll notice that the building in the top left has no number on it. That was supposed to be the basketball court. However, it was not finished in time for the games. And as a result, the basketball games were played in the tennis court, which is not the most ideal place to hold a tennis, or it is an ideal place to hold a tennis game. It's not the ideal place to hold a basketball game. And that's simply because if it rains, they moved in these artificial wooden courts, and when it rained, you just couldn't play. It led to a controversy. Okay, so we'll get to that in one second. Right. Okay, so let's jump into the main body here. I'm going to do a little bit of reading from the chapter, and I'll supplement it a little bit as well. I know I have a habit of starting to read and then getting tired of it, just explaining everything. So I might do that as well. Right. Okay, so in an intense battle with the quote-unquote Japanese military, with their merit already secured, the Chinese army quote-unquote trampled all over enemy territory. This alternate reality where China triumphed and Japan failed, which is a perfect inflection of the 1930s, did not come from the imagination of a scientific writer. It came from the pen of a sports writer who was describing, in rather colorful terms, the Chinese victory over Japan at the final soccer game of the 1934 Far Eastern Championship Games. This author, like millions of his compatriots, likely knew that the triumph was really just a mirage, and that the true battle was really set to take place. The true battle for sports was set to take place in the boardrooms the next day. And the true battle for the very existence of China was set to take place on actual battlefields in the years to come. But that didn't distract from this moment of blind jubilation for this author. Right? So 1934, it was a year of some significance in the Asian sporting world. The matches of the Far Eastern Championship games themselves were incredibly intense, but the boardroom bouts really put those matches to shame. Even before the athletes took to the field, however, at the Far Eastern Championship Games, the Japanese Amateur Athletics Association, they had already done a barnstorming tour through Manila and Shanghai. The Japanese delegates had actually landed in Shanghai the same moment that athletes from all around China gathered in preparation for the games. So there was a situation where there were negotiators above and athletes below. right? So the narrative that I'm going to talk about today really bounces back and forth between these two different groups, the sort of like the owners and the negotiators and the diplomats and the athletes themselves. So the Japanese barnstorming boardroom tour began when a member of the Japanese Amateur Athletic Federation arrived in Manila in January and lobbied for the admission of Manchukuo, the newly created state in what used to be northeastern China, that they enter the Far Eastern Athletic Association and send a delegation to the Far Eastern Championship Games. Right? So the acceptance of Manchukuo into the organization would have provided the country with some semblance of international recognition, which is incredibly important for Japan, especially after their withdrawal from the League of Nations the year before. So the Japanese representative really pushed for the entry of Manchukuo. In response to this, the Chinese delegation did their threatened to boycott the games if Manchukuo was entered. Japan, in turn, threatened to boycott the games if Manchukuo was not entered. And the Philippines was really stuck between a rock and a hard place. They didn't want to lose the international prestige of hosting this event. They also didn't want to lose really a lot of money that they sunk into this Olympics. In fact, I'm sure Tokyo organizers are currently dealing with a similar calculus in the present with whether they should host the 2020 games. A lot at stake here, but fundamentally it's both Japan and China were threatening to withdraw from the games. So the Philippines had to walk a tightrope. They started this by not accepting the entrance of Manchuria due to a technicality. So Manchukuo did not participate in the 1934 Olympics. That said, the story did not end there. Okay, so enter the Olympics, the Far Eastern Championship Games itself. So after the Chinese delegation arrived in Manila, with their coaches, with their diplomats, etc., they started the critical pre-competition banquet circuit, right, which required charisma, tact, and subtlety. Really, the banquet circuit's always one of the most exciting ones for me. Jorge B. Vargas, who is the vice president of the Philippine Amateur Athletic Association, basically one of the hosts, essentially, said, quote, "We do not lose sight of the fact that the complete success shall not be attained if the games fail to foster friendly feeling with other nations participating in the meet." In other words, the stakes of the games were clear. This had to produce a positive image for the Philippines to broadcast around the world. Right? And at the same time, when the shining star of China's athletic world, the famous swimmer Yang Xiuqiu, featured here on the far right, entered the Great Harmony Club. I like the names of the clubs in the early 1930s. It's always something grand like Great Harmony Club. Quote, "It felt like the entire party increased in vigor," end quote. Although the host of the banquet, who is this prominent figure for the Bank of China, gave a gracious toast, and the seasoned diplomat, seen here, Chengting Thomas Wang, delivered a honed diplomatic speech. It was clear to the over 600 guests who were present at the banquet that the quote-unquote Chinese mermaid, as folks like to call Yang Xiuqiu, was the star of the show. Right? Several days later, after the banquet circuit was out of the way, Yang Xiuqiu slipped into the waters of the newly constructed Philippine Aquatic Center to compete in the 50-meter freestyle final. According to reports, at this final, the competition between the Chinese and Filipinos athletes was extremely fierce. Right? However, a Chinese commentator or reporter noted that the quote-unquote expeditionary women's force, the Yuanzheng Zhunyang Zijun, or the Chinese swim team. There's a lot of the military language here, as with the present, or military metaphors for sports teams. They left the local women's team in their wakes. But for Yang Xiuqiong and her fellow swimmers, victory in the pool was really the easy part. Women athletes really carried with them an extra burden as both competitors and symbols of the nation, or as Susan Kahn describes it in her book. In order to deal with this, they developed numerous and often competing strategies to cope with the dissonance between masculine sport and feminine womanhood, a topic that I really expand on in the chapter, but I won't expand too much on here. So back at the opening ceremonies 4 days before, Yang Xiuqiong and her compatriots weathered the unabashed ogling of audience members. One reporter reporting from the event directed his gaze to the Chinese women athletes who followed the flag bearers in the procession, writing, quote, "For a healthy, strong, and beautiful female athletes, their facial features, skin, and muscles were all exceedingly exemplary." Filipino pundits, meanwhile, for their parts, they really echoed this sentiment. They said that the Filipino swimmers were a novelty to see, and they were tank splashers who are educated enough not to be ashamed to appear before the public. Right? I love all this sort of coded gendered language from this time period. The Teofilo Ildefonso is the sort of Filipino star. He anchored the Filipinos men's team, and he, as in the past, won the gold. However, the Filipino men's team was really outclassed by the Japanese men's team, and they lost the overall points. For the Far Eastern Championship games, different teams would accrue points based on which events they won. It's sort of like medaling, but it's like each country sort of gets a grand total. So the Philippines lost 51-19 in men's aquatic events. Okay, so let's jump back to the banquets again for a second. So before the opening ceremony at 8 p.m., May 11th, 1934, the Pan-Pacific Association of China, the Filipino king of the banquet, sort of paralleling our king of the pool, Senate President and soon-to-be Commonwealth President Manuel L. Quezon stepped up to the podium and impressed everyone with his eloquent and polite remarks. Long, a very seasoned diplomat of himself, who blew everyone away by saying, quote, "After the Philippines gains independence and you," in reference to Manuel Quezon, "are elected president, we will have the opportunity to all meet together again in the Malacañang, the presidential palace of the Philippines." In other words, just sort of saying that in the future you're going to be president, and then we're gonna meet there. In other words, charm accomplished. Right? Let's put it that way. So really, the pool and the party, they flowed together, right? The ceremony and the competition, they became one. Yang Xiuqiong might have been the Chinese mermaid in the pool, but I call Chengting Thomas Guang the Chinese merman of the banquet circuit. And sorry, I get really carried away with my metaphors here. I just enjoy it. I don't know why I like it so much, but so they both swam through the ceremony circuit with the grace of a fish, charming their hosts and capturing hearts. However, while the old hats, Quezon and Ildefonso, they still demanded respect with their long and storied career, it was clear that the Chinese visitors were the stars of the show. Unfortunately for the Chinese mermaid and the Chinese merman, however, the basketball court in the boardroom, which would decide the fate of the Far Eastern Championship Games and the Far Eastern Athletic Association, respectively, was the turf of the Filipino Islanders, and the visitors were merely fish out of water. I spent a long time building to that metaphor, so I hope you enjoyed it. Or pun, not metaphor. All right, so let's turn to basketball. We set ourselves up with the banquets and and the swimming events. So now it's time to get to basketball. First, we need to reset our expectations for basketball. Of course, in the present, if any country in Asia is famous for basketball, it is definitely China. Of course, you had Yao Ming sort of taking the NBA by storm in the early thousands. And there's nice Manny Pacquiao there on the on the side as well. I don't know why I like this image, but actually they shouldn't be here. Let's jump ahead. But if we move to the early 20th century, this was not the case. The Philippines, they were the stars of the basketball circuit. And the Filipino team, they featured some of the main all-stars of the day. This is the same team, actually, the Filipino Islanders, who would later go to compete in Berlin at the Berlin Olympics. And there's a controversy, but they said that they should have won a medal. They won more medals than the teams in front of them, but they ended up in 5th place. Completely separate story. Anyways, so during 1934, the Philippine basketball team was definitely the team to beat. And in fact, if you look at the Bulletin of the Far Eastern Championship Games, the same thing that we started this talk with, it sort of just puts you in the mindset of the attitude during the time period. In the face of the impending Olympic battles, perhaps the best attitude to take regarding the chances of the Philippines in basketball, as in any other sport, is the attitude of optimism. However, in taking this attitude, I am not doing so just as a matter of policy. We cannot escape from the facts which point to another Philippine triumph in basketball. Basketball is our forte. It has been our forte during all of these years. We all almost regard the Far Eastern Championship basketball title as the private property of the Philippines. It is the only sport which we have been winning consistently, in which we have tasted the pill of defeat only once. By the way, the Philippines, the one time that they lost was in 1921 to China, and that features earlier in the chapter. However, the Chinese team themselves came with their own bevy of stars, including Wang Yuzheng and Tang Baoqun and Chen Shikun, famous basketballers in their own rights, but they were definitely underdogs in this situation. Okay, so we're going to do a little bit of a dance back and forth here as well between the basketball court and the boardroom. So after the board meetings at the Far Eastern Athletic Association in Shanghai, which we talked about earlier, and after the ceremony circuit, which we just talked about with Quezon and Chengting Thomas Wang, the stage was also set for the final boardroom debates at the end of the Far Eastern Championship Games. The Chinese and Philippine delegations, just like their basketball delegations, also carried a plethora of diplomatic all-stars. You still had Chengting Thomas Wang. There's William Z.L. Sung, who is the secretary for the Chinese National Amateur Athletic Federation. For the Philippines, you had Manuel Quezon. Then you also had Jorge B. Vargas, the vice president of the Amateur Athletic Federation. Unlike the normal uneventful meetings of the past, however, the meeting on May 19th, right at the end of the games, promised controversy because the situation with Manchukuo was still unresolved. So the uncooperative weather also compounded the rocky start of the first bout between the Chinese and Filipino basketballers 3 days earlier. As I had alluded to, the Philippines, or as I alluded to earlier with the outdoor court, at halftime with the Philippines up 26-12. By the way, this is before the 24-second shot clock. So like the games were always low scoring grudge matches. At the beginning of each, or rather after anyone scored, it wasn't the other team who got the ball. They jumped for it again. The rules were quite different during this time period. At halftime, with the Philippines up by quite a bit, the weather gods intervened and a monsoon storm struck, just completely soaking the court. The Philippine team, their head coach, they've lobbied to continue the game because they were up by a whole lot. Meanwhile, the Chinese delegation didn't want to do that because they didn't want to, break their ankles. So initially, the referees gave the game to the Philippines. However, after this last-minute intervention from the Amateur Athletic Association, the Far Eastern Amateur Athletic Association, they decided to replay the game. So back to the meetings. Meanwhile, in the meetings, China and the Philippines were also operating. Oh no, sorry, I skipped that part. These meetings, sort of just like the basketball game itself, met with disaster. The first one ended with an impasse, and the second meeting, which had a, quote, exceedingly intense atmosphere, and, quote, dragged on for 4 hours. It only ended when the Chinese delegation just got up and left and refused to continue negotiating. So after disbanding, the Japanese delegation, meanwhile, they began to broach the possibility of disbanding the Far Eastern Athletic Association altogether and replacing it with a new organization with Manchukuo as a member. To this, the leader of the Chinese delegation vented his frustration and said that Japan wanted to, quote, seduce the Philippines into recognizing the false organization, end quote. The temperature of the room increased as tempers flared like a volatile summer monsoon storm. So after the storm had actually passed, the Islanders, the Filipino team, continued their winning streak on the courts with a less controversial defeat against China the second time around. And then after this routine Philippine victory, however, something strange happened for these Islanders. Again, the Sino so used to winning. They lost to Japan. Right, and this was basically unheard of during this time period. The Philippines fielded a very strong team. China's team was pretty well known as well. Japan was sort of they excelled in track and field, they excelled in volleyball, they excelled in baseball. Basketball is not necessarily their forte. However, the Philippines lost. Which brings in some new folks in our boardroom delegation scene. So jumping back from basketball to the boardrooms, an even more shocking event rippled through the boardrooms. The Philippines also succumbed to Japan at the negotiation table. So Hironobu Ryozo, who is the head of the Japanese delegation, scheduled a last-minute board meeting, scheduled on May 21st. It was the day, actually, that delegates were scheduled to head home from the competition. And according to conflicting reports, representatives from Japan and the Philippines tried to reach out to the Chinese delegation to inform them that they were holding a meeting, and they were unable to. So they proceeded without China. So without China, they agreed to disband the Far Eastern Athletic Association and create a new organization, the Amateur Athletic Association of the Orient, with Manchukuo as a member state. And the first round of the new organization was set to host a new Olympic Games in Tokyo in 1938. So fresh off the boat, Shen Silian, or William C.L. Sung, called this nothing less than a farce, right? But of course, this is not during the meeting itself. This is after he had made it back home and had no say in this decision. So the final basketball match between China and the Philippines was also rescheduled, just like the sort of last minute boardroom negotiation. It was rescheduled for the day before. So unlike the board meeting, Chinese players were actually notified and actually showed up to compete in this match. However, the result was the same. The Philippines pulled away with a 44-33 victory. Chinese observers cried foul. They complained that 4 early fouls by against a Chinese star, Tang Baoqun, which removed him from the game, was this pattern of unfair officiating by the ref, sort of, I guess, paralleling this unfair decision-making in the boardrooms. One Chinese commentator wrote that the referees knew the facts but forgot the method, and that they were harboring bias for the Philippines. So on the court and in the boardrooms, things began to fall apart for China. Reflecting back on the games as a whole, one Filipino pundit lamented, quote, "Years ago, we could beat Japan in almost any game and at any time. But today, for the Filipinos to win over the Japanese in any sport is for a hippopotamus to pass through the eye of a needle." I always keep trying to picture this metaphor as well. Despite their continued supremacy in basketball, and despite a surprise victory over Japan in baseball, which I think was their only victory over Japan in baseball through the entire games, Filipino athletes began to fall behind their Japanese peers. In track and field events, just like the swimming events, Japan was left the overwhelming victory. They had 51 points to 19 points for the Philippines. So for the Philippines, the decision to side with Japan in the boardroom, these negotiations, it was not necessarily a proud one, but it was a practical one. And pundits, as pundits are wont to do, naturally disagreed. Right? Jumping back. So commentators from the Philippines and China, they skewered members of the Filipino Amateur Athletic Association. They held back no punches. The editor of the Philippine magazine called it a piece of unmatchable stupidity by the Philippine Amateur Athletic Association, the sort of illegal, again, this illegal canceling and disbandment of the Far Eastern Championship Games in the Far Eastern Athletic Association. Ho Gun-sun, who's featured here on the left, also pulled no punches. He said, quote, "For those struggling before the world for independence every single day, but are willing to sell their independence, will this action gain the favor of those who would purchase said independence?" In other words, how does selling out to Japan prove that you can defend your independence from Japan? So Philippines during this time period was in the midst of heated debates about impending independence and what that meant in a world where you had, well, just very militarized and aggressive neighbors. So Jorge B. Vargas, on the other hand, and he's the insider who basically made the decision to side with Japan and disband the organization. He attempted to deflect some of the criticism with discursive gymnastics. He wrote, quote, "We have nothing but the highest esteem and respect for our Chinese friends, and we wish to assure them that our position has been dictated only by an impartial desire to adhere strictly to the language of the Constitution." End quote. Unfortunately for Vargas, gymnastics was not one of the recognized sports for the Far Eastern Championship Games. One Filipino commentator who went by the nickname of Putakte or Wasp, they said, quote, "Wouldn't it be a good idea to send our athletes to Shanghai and Secretary Vargas to Tokyo to represent the Philippines in 1938? Send those delegates away to Tokyo. They can have fun. We're going to have our matches in Shanghai." On the other hand, back in China, John Moa, who's the head coach of the Chinese athletic delegation, he chose to strike a diplomatic note by avoiding the controversy of the boardroom altogether. Instead, he just talked about the games. When sports become inexorably tied up with politics, the wise coach knows how to channel their inner Houdini. And Chung Ting Thomas Wong, meanwhile, the leader of the Chinese Amateur Athletic Association, who is the delegate there at the banquet circuit, he also sounded a positive note after he returned to China. He said, "Our country and the Philippines maintain extremely friendly relations, and though the Philippines has been duped by Japan, they will soon realize and regret this decision. When the negotiations also appear unreconcilable, The wise diplomat knows how to leave open a side door. So we're moving here. Let's go here. Okay, so after 1 week under the Manila sun and through several summer monsoons, these are merely the trailer for the 30 by 30 documentary of the next decade. Though the events of the weeks faded into the pages of history, the lessons echoed through the eons, like the reverberations of a well-struck baseball in a hushed stadium. It was impossible for the Philippines to remain neutral in the conflict between China and Japan in sports disputes and in war. The athletes themselves would learn this lesson, of course, as most of them ended up serving during the war. Their old sporting foes trading jerseys for a different kind of uniform. And I like ending with this image from the Philippines Free Press, first of all, just because there's so much action going on here. But it really represents a good Philippine perspective on independence and World War II. So as Filipino delegates are going to the United States to lobby for independence from the United States, at the same time, there's a sort of a contrasting voice that's arguing for continued American occupation of the Philippines due to safety concerns with the looming war between Japan and China on the horizon. Okay, so that's what I have for my talk. I think was that 45 minutes? I think that's how much time I had left to talk. Of course, I can answer a whole lot of other questions and fill in plenty of other information from different parts of the chapter as well. But that's all I wanted to share with you today. Does anyone have any questions or comments? I hear dogs.
Thank you, Philip. That was wonderful. I see a couple of questions. I see there's a question from Michael DeCenzo, a question from Fallon Lonatic, and then from Carol Mallison. Why don't we start with the student, and then we'll go to you, Michael. All right. Go ahead, Fallon.
Oh no, I didn't have a question. I was just saying thank you and good job.
Oh, okay. Then Professor DeCenzo, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute. You're gonna have to start again. You're on mute.
Joys of Zoom.
Sorry about that. Did you have Phil Jackson in your mind when you were thinking about the triangle offense?
I did. I mean, I grew up in the 90s with the Bulls championship team, so I couldn't help but pass it up. There's just a triangle everywhere. Like in the middle of the chapter, I talk about the Springfield College. In Springfield College, their symbol is the triangle. The mind body, and what is it? The mind body, and I forget the third part of the triangle. And then there's China, Japan, and the Philippines. So there's another triangle, and then we're talking about basketball. So yeah, it's a little bit of a pun. Instead of the triangle offense, it's the triangle offense, right? So
Jackson was kind of known for his Far Eastern sense of philosophy as well. I didn't know if that figured in any of your thinking about covering this topic. He didn't do too well when he came back to the Knicks, either with his philosophy or the triangle. You could hear that?
Yeah, sorry, you're cutting out a little bit there. I assume it's it's my fault. It's my internet. It says my internet connection is unstable.
Yeah, so I think Jackson was celebrated for being a kind of mystical Eastern thinker as a way of inspiring players, and he was a kind of offbeat guy playing himself. And I didn't know if that figured in any of your looking at the players and using his triangle offense just in terms of his kind of larger global sense.
Yeah, I didn't have that in mind. I was aware that I know he, like, during some of his practices, like with the Lakers, he practiced some Zen Buddhism type techniques, I believe, right? So yeah, I'm aware of it. I wonder if I could incorporate that somewhere into the chapter. Yeah, I'll think about incorporating some of that into the chapter. I'm sure folks would like it. Thanks for the question.
But I can ask another one if people are waiting. Patricia, I don't want to jump in. If there's someone else.
Nobody has raised their hand yet. I have a question, but why don't you ask yours first, and then I think we will see more questions.
Sure. So when you look at the hierarchy of playing for championships and playing other nations, was there a system of preparing the players at school levels or playground levels so they could advance to the higher levels?
Yeah, that's a great question. To some degree, yes. The Philippines had a very famous public education system, and physical education was like a key pillar of that. So there was a whole system for education in the Philippines. They also had a pretty sophisticated, what do they call it, the intercollegiate competitions. And they had the Ateneo, like the Blue Eagles competition. They have their own sports rivalries going on within the Philippines. China is a much more complicated story, just partially because of the size of the country and everything that they're working with. There were a lot of private schools established, especially in the major cities, first by missionaries, but then by wealthy Chinese entrepreneurs as well, that emphasized the physical education. I showed you a little image of John Mo earlier, and he was one of the sort of key, or one of the most famous figures in physical education, promoting it, the dissemination of physical education throughout China. He was the director of physical education of Tsinghua, which was also this college that was initially established as an American preparatory school for Chinese folks who got the Boxer Indemnity scholarship to go study in the United States. So there were these institutions in China as well, but it was really much more chaotic and decentralized. They had national games every year as well, which sort of produced talent for the.
If I may, I'll just a quick follow up, and then I'll desist.
For the gays again.
So you mentioned earlier, Philip, that there's no time clock for shooting then, and that certainly revolutionized the game. Men's basketball and women's, once they put a clock in. And I know you're focused on it a little earlier period, but was there a sense of American basketball, which was the preeminent basketball in the world during that period of time? And I'm thinking particularly of Dean Smith, the coach of North Carolina, whose four-corner offense could take up practically the whole game without taking a shot. And I don't know if anyone tried to use that kind of ball control to work for shaping up when you took a shot.
Oh yeah, and I could definitely geek out on this for a long time, but we shouldn't do it too much. But one quick anecdote on this. I mean, basketball was introduced in China and the Philippines in the late 19th century. So just like shortly after Naismith invented it in Springfield. So that, they've been playing it there just as long as they've been playing it in the United States, just about, basically. And there were a lot of innovators there as well. The Philippine Islanders were famous for the national team. They were famous for small ball. But I mean, it's like a default almost for the Philippines. You have to go with small ball, just due to the relative stature of players. But some folks have written some good books. There's, what's his name? Lu Antoli Hao who published a book called, what is it called? It's the Playing with the Big Boys, I believe it's called. It's a pretty good book, and it really gets into the Philippine basketball mentality. But it's kind of amazing reading through some of these accounts, because they're talking about how people are shooting the long shot. This is before the 3-point line, of course, but they're shooting the long shot and they're accurate, and they said dribble the spheroid behind their backs. So that sort of, so you can see that there's a lot of emphasis on this sort of like the flow offense of today, even before that became that became a thing.
And women's basketball had 6 players rather than 5. Was there ever any consideration of that?
Yeah, I don't. From all the time period that I've read, it was 5 players. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat. Oh, hold on. We have a question in the chat. The question is, do you think there are hopes of having such an international competition between these countries again? And do you think that it would improve the relationships between the countries if there were, through business and cultural exchange among the participants?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. And in general, I think I present things in a rosier picture than I probably should. This is sort of just me reflecting to historiography, which is largely focused on discussions of really just sort of anti-Chinese like sentiments in the Philippines, and not just in the early 20th century, but over the long durée. So in ways, I think I have a little bit more of an optimistic vantage point when I'm presenting this information than maybe I necessarily should. But yes, I do think sports are definitely an avenue to bring people together. There still are the Asian Games. The Asian Games sort of replaced the Far Eastern Championship Games after, I think the first one's in 1950. This was a much broader competition. It included countries from Western Asia as well. You had India and Iran and Afghanistan in there as well. Actually, through the early games, there was still the same type of competition between China and the Philippines. They were 2 of the sort of premier leaders in these sports. And I think for basketballers, they speak the common language of not just basketball, but the hope of basketball. And I don't know, with more recent relations taking a sort of a sour tone, first with disputes over South China Sea islands, but then also with the sort of gambling controversies. More recently, relations between China and the Philippines have not been as good as they can be, although I guess Duterte is a little bit of like an apologist in some ways. But I do think basketball is a common language that folks have, and there's long traditions in both countries. So I think it can build some bridges. Just put it that way. Does that answer your question?
It answers it for me. I don't know if it does for the person who asked it, but if this person wants to make a follow-up, that would be great. I have actually 2 questions. The first is a question about the legality of the vote, where the Chinese delegates were not present. How was that even? I can understand by oops, didn't get the message. That part I understand very well, but how was it that that this vote was allowed to stand? That's my first question.
Yeah, it was definitely illegal, according to the bylaws of the Constitution of the Far Eastern Athletic Association. And a lot of people pointed this out, obviously, from China. It says, look at, what is it, Section 3. It says, all members have to be present and all have to vote. Japan, Philippines didn't care. They just, yeah.
That's the thing. And my second question is actually about the various artifacts that you used in this in your PowerPoint. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came to get them, and this, that, and the other thing? They're wonderful. The photographs and
asking about the photographs. Yeah. There are a lot of different sources for those. Actually, I can jump back through them to look at them. This is just from the Philippines Free Press. This is from the 1930s. These ones are both from Wikimedia Commons. So these ones you can find through just regular searches. This one's from Sino-Philippine, which is like a popular Chinese sports monthly in the 30s. They had a lot of great pictures. This is just from an online database, the 全国报刊所引. What do they call that? The national, I don't know. It's just a digitized version of a lot of periodicals from this time period. And then, this is from visits to Springfield College archives, and yeah, it's just a slow collection. I like to collect things, I guess. The bulletin for the Far Eastern Championship Games. This is a really neat bulletin. I could only find one copy. It was at Ateneo de Manila, the special library there. So that's just from my collections from there. That one's just from the internet. Yeah. Oh, there's also, this is from a neat souvenir. There's a Chinese basketball exhibition where they went to play in various cities in Japan, and these images are both from that. So it's just from collecting.
Wonderful. We have another question from the chat. The question says, since all three countries appeared at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin, was there any extra animosity that carried over from what took place 2 years earlier?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I'm sure for the Chinese participants, this Chinese delegation was relatively small from what I recall. I think it was the coach of the Chinese, no. One of the Chinese, like the head of the delegation to the Philippines, later became the first Chinese referee at the Berlin Olympics. And then, so that probably meant that he was serving as referee for the Philippine team that was playing that defeated his team. So I mean, there probably could have been animosity in there. I could see it, but I didn't really look at too many records from the Berlin games, so I couldn't directly answer it. I could just imagine animosity carrying forward. The Berlin Olympics are just a fascinating topic for their own right. Yeah. And there's been some great work done on those as well. But I don't know. Maybe I'll look into it.
Exactly. I was just thinking it might be something for you to look into as you finish up this project. Thomas has a wonderful comment. He says, I've looked at the politicization of sports today as if it were new, but seeing sports role in an Olympic-like event shows this is nothing new, rather informative.
Yeah, it's hard to not have that takeaway, but I'm watching the 1930s and I'm getting frustrated as people are saying the equivalent of the shut up and dribble to the athletes, and I'm like just so mad that these things these attitudes and politics seem to so easily invade and take over sports. So thanks for that comment. That was a great comment.
Do we have any additional questions? I'm sure there must be some questions for Professor Guingona. Yes, go ahead, Michael.
Okay, I don't want to intrude if others have questions. So Philip, as you well know, basketball these days gets vertical very quickly. And having tall players makes a difference. So I had a couple of quick questions in that regard. My son, who survived my coaching because he went to Hofstra basketball camp, ended up playing in Argentina. And he was the Nassau County basketball scholar athlete the year he graduated from high school. So we went to Argentina to watch him play. And the first question he got when he was playing in Argentina, not only him, but the other players were, do any of you play above the hoop? So, we're looking at cultures that don't have great heights. And I don't know and this is a small matter compared to the intercultural stuff you do, but whether dunking the ball, became a factor anywhere along the way when you're looking. I saw Yao Ming appear on, of course, he was amazing from China, but I didn't know if you encountered that in the Philippines or elsewhere.
Yeah, in the 30s, I don't know. I know much more recently, teams in the Philippines and China, there are plenty of 6, 7, well, not 7, well, a few 7-footers there. My father actually used to play for the, I don't know, what was the, he's from the Philippines. He did his college in the Philippines, and he played college basketball, and he's 6'3", and he can easily dunk easily dunk the ball. So I mean, it's nowadays it's not so much an issue. I don't know about the 1930s. I don't, like, all the accounts that I read, I didn't see any reference to dunking, so I'm guessing that it might not exist, but I never actually ran like a search through like for search terms. I'm not even sure in Chinese if it would be the same term that they use today for dunking. They might even have a different term. In other words, today, yes. In the past, I'm not sure.
So I actually was under the impression that dunking actually wasn't permitted at various points in the history of basketball.
Was it banned?
And I tried to do a little Google search, and I didn't get very far in it. But the first, and I haven't read the article, but it does say, why did the NCAA ban dunking for 10 years? But yeah, I didn't know enough about it to kind of to give an answer, but I knew I'd heard something about something like that. I don't know, another avenue to go down in this talk.
Yeah. It's an interesting question. I'm sure Lou and Tolihau writes about it in his book. And I'm trying to think. I know a few folks have written about basketball in China too. Judy Pallenbaum. Yeah, I could probably ask them. I bet they would know.
Both my mother and I played basketball in high school, and if anybody has seen me in real life, I am not terribly tall. Stop laughing. But when talking to my mother about the game, it sounded like a completely different game. Women's basketball was so different, before I went to school. I mean, by the time I was playing basketball, it was pretty much the same game with some exceptions. But when she was playing it, I don't know what the heck it was. But it certainly didn't.
What's striking is how good women have become at basketball, like a lot of other sports. And your comment, I don't know about your mother, but women's basketball, I asked Philip earlier, was 6 women on a team. 3 women could only play defense. They couldn't go up, and maybe that would apply to your
the biggest change. Yeah.
And the other, because they didn't want girls sweat. They thought it was too much effort for them to be running around. And to look at what women have done in all kinds of sports, including being banned from the Olympics, from marathon running and basketball in particular, is to see the human capability for athleticism. I don't know, Philip, if you looked at women in the Philippines and the Far East at all.
Sort of a broad question, but yes.
I didn't mean
I think you meant in terms of sport.
Yes.
I meant in basketball.
Yeah. So actually it was, let's see, it was 1923 that women first participated in the Far Eastern Championship Games, and it had to be in the sort of the refined sports of like tennis, I believe volleyball. And they were non-medaling, so they weren't actually playing for any medals. But from several accounts from basketball in the Philippines, a lot of people were promoting it as more of a genteel sport that women could also play. So it says I have an unstable internet connection again. I'm not sure
We can hear you.
I hope you can still hear me. Okay. Yes, I sometimes right around now, everyone starts to load up their computers. My bandwidth dies a little bit. So yeah, in the Philippines, I know women's participation or girls' participation in physical education was central to the educational system, and a lot of women play basketball. Yeah. Sorry, come on, internet connection.
Do we have any additional questions? Let me ask one additional question, and this is, you're wrapping up this project, clearly. And I'm very excited about this, and I'm looking forward to seeing it in print. But I'm wondering, what are you looking to doing in terms of your next projects?
God, next projects. That is a great question. I have quite a few. Actually, just from writing this book, I think each chapter I've probably, I'm not even sure what the editor is going to tell me. Like each chapter, I'm getting close to 20,000 words. So, I'm trying as best as possible to make everything manageable. But I have so many unfinished stories that I have to, that I want to publish. Including, I could just continue to write about sports and basketball. But some of the new projects that I am working on is thinking about writing about liberalism in Asia, Asian liberalism. And this is partially because of what, and we get to our section on Enlightenment thought and, Atlantic revolutions. I'm teaching world history. All of our conversations of liberalism are often very Atlantic focused. But through my research, when I was looking through, I spent there's one chapter that I write about the education and the education system in the Philippines and China, and sort of Chinese modeling off of the Philippine education system. A lot of the key sort of educators that I encountered during this time period, a lot of them studied at Columbia with John Dewey, and I was really interested in doing the tentative title is called Dewey's Decimals. And I was thinking about writing about John Dewey's disciples or students in Asia and their promotion of Asian liberalism. Like Hofstra, of course, is one of the more famous of these figures, but Ambedkar from India, also studied with Dewey, and then the Philippines, Camilo Osias, a very famous educator, also studied with Dewey. So I was thinking about writing about education liberalism in Asia through John Dewey and his disciples. So that was one project that I'm working on. Otherwise, I have a whole lot of others, but I don't know if anyone wants to hear about those.
How did you get interested in sports and sports, politics, and history, or sports as a vehicle for politics, or I don't even know what, Yeah,
it's a good question. Well, I guess one of my not advisors, but colleagues at the University of Buffalo, Susan Kahn, she's like one of the leading sports historians for, well, not just women's sports, but sports in general. And she very much inspired me to look into sports as a means of interaction, but also just looking through sources. I sort of set out with a goal of just trying to capture all types of interactions between folks from China and the Philippines. And a lot of these sources kept pointing me towards these athletic competitions, because this was just a major avenue for interaction. So two different directions then. One is just inspired by good historians. The second is the direction that the sources are pointing me in. I was going to say one other thing for this too, but I'm losing it. Nope, I'm blanking. That's it.
that's okay. But it's interesting, by encouraging encouraging you to the reality that history is around us everywhere, you are able to uncover many of these stories which have simply become buried in the passage of time.
Yeah, very much so. And actually, you reminded me of what I was going to talk about too. It's when I was reading up on the historiography of just sports history generally, one of the common refrains from almost every major work by a sports historian is about how historians don't treat sports seriously and athletes don't treat academia seriously. And I was always very frustrated by this. I'll say it's a two-way looking down upon. And I was always frustrated by this division there. I was like, well, the sports, it's just a perfect microcosm of what's going on in Asia during the time period. Like as I'm reading through the matches, these competitions that took place, it just looked like a perfect parallel of the debates that were going on in the boardroom. And if you look at those debates in the boardroom, it's just a perfect parallel of what's going on in the League of Nations. So for me, it was just I don't know, it was almost an obvious connection that sports were central to the story and they belong in history. Yeah.
Philip, on your last point, I can't remember the author's name, but he taught, I think, literature at the University of Indiana, and he wrote an amazing book that goes to the notion of connecting sports and history and society and evaluating it. And his book appropriately is called Beer and Circus. And it's so revelatory about so many dimensions of sports and society, including so much corruption. And one of the things that I found particularly disturbing when I read the book was the complicity of college faculty in giving free rides to so-called scholarship athletes who are needed for the teams when they weren't earning their way in class. Now, that's not true at all schools, but the guy who wrote the book actually was given a paid sabbatical because he got so many death threats at Indiana, where Bobby Knight was the basketball coach. So I recommend that book to you if you haven't had a chance to see it. Beer and Circus.
Yeah, I haven't. I wrote it down. This is high on my list now. Was that a comment from the?
No, that's the author. The author is Murray Sperber.
Oh, very nice. Actually, our library still uses the Dewey Decimal System. I have no idea why.
Do we have any additional questions? I would love to hear questions from other people who are here today.
I have plenty of fun stories to tell. So. Can I ask a quick question?
Tell us a story, Amir Khan says. But it looks like Phil wants to ask a question first.
Yeah. I think it probably makes more sense when I was like, if you're reading the chapter itself, but I really tried to like portray the parallels, like what's going on in the court versus what's going on in like the boardroom or the banquets. Did that work or was it confusing?
I think it worked. I think the first time it came up, you kind of wonder, wait a minute, why are we going from, young people in shorts, to these fancy people in fancy dress? But then it becomes abundantly clear that you are showing how both teams, so to speak, are playing, high stakes games.
Actually, I didn't even think about it playing games. That's I should say that.
We have another question besides the request for you to tell us a story. Someone wants to know if you traveled for your research and if there are any museums dedicated to these games.
That's a great question. I'll do that. I'll answer that question first before I tell stories. I don't know where my stories are going to take me. I'm sure I'll get myself in trouble with my stories. So travel for the research, definitely spent a long time in different archives in China and the Philippines and the United States. I still have yet to go to Taiwan, which is really I just need to do it based on the research that I'm doing. But the research funding only stretches so far. So I went to archives and libraries in Beijing, Shanghai, and Xiamen, and Manila, and the national archives everywhere. So yeah, I've traveled to a lot of places. Are there any museums dedicated to these games? Not that I know of. In fact, I wonder if they did have one. I guess it probably would be in Shanghai, Manila, or Tokyo. These are the three host cities. Actually, Osaka hosted once. So it probably is in one of those cities, but this would be a great museum to make. So if it doesn't exist, I think I think it should exist. I wonder if there's just a general Asian Olympics museum. I did go to the museum at Springfield College. They have a small museum, with Naismith has invented basketball at Springfield College. So there's some neat nuggets of information there, and you can see his application. And actually, I really enjoyed the research at Springfield College because a lot of the athletes who participated in the games later went to Springfield College and wrote these dissertations and theses on whatever sport they did. It was kind of neat to sort of get that angle into their lives and to see them really just interacting with one another in classrooms and in public events. So in other words, I'm not sure if there's a museum dedicated to the games. There should be. And then the museum at Springfield College is really neat. If any of you are going to make a trip to the Basketball Hall of Fame, which is also in Springfield, make a little trip over to the Springfield College Museum as well. It's a neat little collection. And then for stories, let's see, where should the stories take me? I did discover a lot of interesting things when I was doing my research. So, for example, I was in one of my other chapters. I frequently came across a pretty prominent politician and writer from the Philippines, Carlos P. Romulo, right? He was actually the president of the UN in 1950, something like that. So he's a pretty famous person. But I was, reading some accounts from him from the 1930s when he's talking about Manuel Quezon and China and all these things. And I was telling my father about that. I said, hey, Papa, this is read about Carlos P. Romulo, and he's saying all this stuff. And then my father says, "Oh, Carlos P. Romulo, that's my godfather." And I was like, are you kidding me? Carlos P. Romulo is your godfather? You didn't tell me. First of all, how on earth are you so well connected? Carlos P. Romulo is a pretty famous person. But then also I don't know. And then at another point, I actually discovered that my grandfather, who is Filipino, he actually visited Shanghai for his honeymoon in the 1930s. And I was writing, my first chapter in the book. It's about the Filipino community in Shanghai, and I didn't know I was writing about. Well, I guess my grandfather's. My grandfather was actually there during this time period. So it's kind of neat. These are just little stories about when you're doing research, when you're going through the process, and you find all these random connections to your life that you didn't know existed. It's definitely the funnest part of research, going through the archives and discovering random nuggets of information that'll stick with you.
Wonderful. I think that's actually probably a nice place to end our conversation today. Once again, I would like to thank you, Philip, for coming to Hofstra, even if only virtually, to give a wonderful and very informative talk. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. I really appreciate it. Thanks for the questions.